Stan says, excuse me, our reading this morning is Psalm 53, headed up in the CSB as a portrait for sinners, for the choir director on Mahalath, a maskil of David. The fool says in his heart, "There's no God." They are corrupt and they do vile deeds. There is no one who does good. God looks down from heaven on the human race to see if there is one who is wise, one who seeks God. All have turned away. All alike have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one. Will evildoers never understand? They consume my people as they consume bread. They do not call on God. Then they will be filled with dread like no other, because God will scatter the bones of those who besiege you. You will put them to shame, for God has rejected them. Oh, that Israel's deliverance would come from Zion. When God restores the fortunes of his people, let Jacob rejoice, let Israel be glad.
Doesn't happen very often, but there are times when you get a new version of well-known songs. I don't mean a new recording of them, like what Taylor Swift did, re-recording all her first 6 albums after she failed to obtain the master recordings of them, or even a live recording of the same song. I mean a new version of the song by the same artist, like the original, but altered because of a change in situation. For instance, Elton John's Candle in the Wind, written in 1973, was originally about Marilyn Monroe. But in 1997, a new version came out. Still the same song, but the lyrics were altered to make it a tribute to Princess Diana, which he sung at her funeral. Or the football anthem, Three Lions, originally written by Baddiel, Skinner and the Lightning Seeds, to mark the England men's football team's participation at Euro 96, which England was hosting. But such was its popularity that it was updated for a World Cup in 1998, and then again in 2010, then a Lionesses version in the summer of 2022, and then one for the men's team at the end of that year. 5 versions in total, with slight rewrites to reflect the changing circumstances and the fact that the 30 years of hurt for the men's team in 1996 had become 56 years of hurt in 2022. Now, our passage this morning, Psalm 53, is a new version of an earlier psalm, Psalm 14. Listen to what Spurgeon said of Psalm 53. He says, "It's not a copy of a 14th psalm, amended and revised by a foreign hand. It is another edition by the same author, emphasized in certain parts and rewritten for another purpose." Though written by the same author, King David, and almost identical, Psalm 53 is not simply a copy of Psalm 14. There are a couple of changes to it, and the reason for this is that the 2 psalms have different purposes. And it's observing these changes and these different purposes that will help us to understand why Psalm 14 was rewritten, and we have in our Bible Psalm 53. So before we work our way verse by verse through this song, let's just think about what makes these 2 psalms different. And the first thing to note is an obvious one, and that is the placement of the psalms. Psalm 14 comes after Psalm 13 and before Psalm 15, and Psalm 53 comes after Psalm 52 and before Psalm 54. And that is important. Psalm 14 ends a section of the Psalms that began with Psalm 3. Having been introduced to this man who is both righteous and royal in Psalm 1 and 2, a king who is blessed by God, Psalm 3 to 14 describes how this king is rejected by people, terrorized by the wicked, opposed by powerful enemies. And yet he keeps trusting God. and keeps crying out to God for salvation. He waits patiently for God to act. And at the end of Psalm 14, he is certain that he will. That the Lord will restore his fortunes and that of his people. His people being the righteous whom God is present with, those who have made God their refuge. And so the purpose of Psalm 14 was very much to provide assurance for God's king and God's people who are opposed by the wicked, that the Lord will care for them and protect them and provide the rescue which they need. Now, the heading given to Psalm 53 is different to the one for Psalm 14. That was simply for the choir director of David. Here in Psalm 53, if you look down at it with me, you'll see it says, for the choir director on Mahalath, which means most likely the setting for this psalm was some kind of suffering or illness or sickness, a maskil of David. That word maskil appears in the superscription of Psalm 52, the psalm before, and also Psalm 54 and 55, which suggests that these four psalms are to be read together. And when you look at its setting of the psalms either side of this one, Psalm 52 being when Doeg the Edomite went and reported to Saul, telling him David went to Ahimelech's house, and then Psalm 54, which the setting is when the Ziphites went and said to Saul, "Is David not hiding among us?" We're given a clue then about the setting for Psalm 53. Psalm 52 and Psalm 54 takes us to a time in David's life when he was on the run from King Saul, recorded for us in 1 Samuel 21 to 26. And between the incident with Doeg and the Ziphites, David had dealings with a man called Nabal and his wife Abigail in 1 Samuel 25. This dealing was just after the prophet Samuel had died. David was in the wilderness, keeping out of Saul's way, when he heard that Nabal, this rich man, whose servants David had treated well, was nearby in Carmel to shear his sheep and was hosting a feast for his shearers. And so David sent 10 of his men to Nabal to ask him for provisions. But Nabal's response was to say no, to insult David, who was going to be the future king. Well, David, angered by his response, got his men to put on their swords, and they went there on their way to Nabal to get revenge. But on the way, he was met by Nabal's wife, Abigail, who intervened, telling David not to act as Nabal had been, and provided him with the supplies he asked for. Let me just read from 1 Samuel 25, verses 23 to 27. This is what we're told. When Abigail saw David, she quickly got off the donkey and knelt down with her face to the ground and paid homage to David. She knelt at his feet and said, "The guilt is mine, my lord, but please let your servant speak to you directly. Listen to the words of your servant. My lord should pay no attention to this worthless fool, Nabal, for he lives up to his name. His name means stupid, and stupidity is all he knows. I, your servant, didn't see my lord's young men whom you sent. Now, my lord, as surely as the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, it is the Lord who kept you from participating in bloodshed and avenging yourself by your own hand. May your enemies and those who intend to harm my lord be like Nabal. Let this gift your servant has brought to my lord be given to the young men who follow my lord." In Abigail's response here, we learn that Nabal's name means fool. Keep that in mind when we return to Psalm 53. And Nabal's actions certainly lived up to his name. Later in the chapter, we find out what happens to him. Abigail tells of her interaction with David, and then we read 1 Samuel 25, verses 37 to 39. In the morning when Nabal sobered up, his wife told him about these events. His heart died, and he became a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal dead. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Blessed be the Lord who championed my cause against Nabal's insults and restrained his servant from doing evil. The Lord brought Nabal's evil deeds back on his own head." Now, this incident here in 1 Samuel 25 helps us to understand the purpose of Psalm 53 and explains why Psalm 14 was rewritten for this new occasion. Whereas Psalm 14 gave assurance to God's king and his people of the Lord's protection and his care, Psalm 53 is a warning to the fool, to Nabal, and those who act like he did, that God will judge them. And this change of emphasis is seen here in the psalm in two ways. Firstly, and most clearly, in verse 5. In Psalm 14, verses 5 and 6, David's emphasis is on God being with the righteous and being a refuge of the oppressed. There we read, "Then they will be filled with dread, for God is with those who are righteous. You sinners frustrate the plans of the oppressed, but the Lord is his refuge." But in Psalm 53, verse 5, there's no mention of God's people at all. Really, its only focus is on the downfall of the fool. Verse 5 of our passage we read, "Then they will be filled with dread, dread like no other, because God will scatter you, scatter the bones of those who besiege you. You will put them to shame, for God has rejected them." So that's one way we see this difference come through. But there is a second way this is seen, and this is far more subtle. In Psalm 14, we have 4 references to the Lord. That's a personal name for God, Yahweh in Hebrew. The name he revealed to his people who he had rescued and made his own and set apart. In Psalm 53, there is no mention of the Lord, only God, which is Elohim in the Hebrew, a name that speaks of God's power and might and strength as a creator and king. And when you consider the purposes of each of the Psalms, that makes absolute sense why. Of course, God's personal name would be used when emphasizing God's care of his own. And then when speaking of his judgment, well, it's more fitting that a general one is used that draws attention to God being the creator to whom all are accountable to. Now, I know I just spent quite a bit of time looking at how Psalm 14 and Psalm 53 are different. And it is a bit more technical than I'd usually go. But I hope by doing this, you'll be able to see more clearly what Psalm 53 is saying to us that Psalm 14 doesn't. How the big thing this psalm wants to drive home to us is this, that the fool who rejects God will be rejected by God. And this is what we'll spend most of our time looking at. So firstly, the fool that rejects God will be rejected by God. The fool that rejects God will be rejected by God. Look at verse 1 with me. The fool says in his heart, "There's no God. They are corrupt, and they do vile deeds. There is no one who does good." David describes here the fool. As I said a few minutes ago, the word for fool is Nabal. And no doubt David would have had that Nabal he had encountered in mind as he rewrote this psalm. But he's not just describing that Nabal. He's describing everyone who says in their heart, "There's no God." Who's he talking about? Well, he's not primarily addressing the intellectual atheist who thinks any form of God is a delusion. Rather, he has in mind anyone who lives as if there is no God, who says, "No God for me," who intentionally or unintentionally lives their lives the way they think best without any reference to God, who does not believe that God sees or cares about what they do, nor will he hold them to account. And this shows itself in practical ways. They are corrupt, they do vile deeds. The fool lives in a way that says God does not exist. At the end of verse 1 comes a phrase that should concern each one of us listening this morning. There is no one who does good. No one. Just consider those two words for a moment. No one. No one. David writes, no one does good. Not a single person does good. He's including every single person upon this world. He's including himself. Surely he's got that wrong, hasn't he? Because we know good people, don't we? You know good people. Well, yes, there are good people if we're talking about people who live upright lives as far as they conform to some human standard that's been agreed over time. There's plenty of people like that. But doing good here is about doing what God says is good, and his standard is far higher than any human goodness meter. No one does good. Which, circling back, means that everyone lives in a way that says there is no God. So everyone is guilty of being the fool. You, I, are guilty of being the fool. Again, let's be clear. This isn't about saying we believe that God doesn't exist. You can say there is a God and still live as if there isn't. You see, the fool here lives life as if God does not exist. In verses 2 and 3, we get God's view on the matter. Look at verse 2. God looks down from heaven on the human race to see if there is one who is wise, one who seeks God. God comes to inspect humanity. He investigates what people are like. No creature is hidden from his sight. He sees every human heart, every human thought, every human action, every human motive, every human life, scrutinizing, assessing, examining, and he's looking to see if there are any who are wise, who seek him. And what does he find? Are there any? Verse 3. All have turned away. All alike have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one. All have, all alike, no one, not even one. This is universal language. We're included in this, as are every descendant of Adam and Eve. We turned away. By nature, we do not seek after God, having no desire to know him or to have a relationship with him. We reject him. And when God, who is the basis for right and wrong, is rejected, well, immoral and ungodly behavior follows. That's the argument Paul makes when he writes in Romans 1 verse 28. He says there, and because they did not think it worthwhile to acknowledge God, God delivered them over to a corrupt mind so that they do what is not right. We have become corrupt, meaning our whole lives are tainted, polluted, rotten with sin. Every part of us is affected. Not one area is left untouched. We do not and cannot do what is good according to what God says is good. Verse 4 goes on to describe what this life of rejecting God is like. Will evildoers never understand? They consume my people as they consume bread. They do not call on God. It's marked by three things: is ignorance of God's verdict on their lives, hostility to God's people, and a refusal to call on God. The fool rejects God. They say in their heart, there is no God. And who is the fool that rejects God? It's not just Nabal. It's me. It's you. In verse 5, we have God's response to the fool that rejects him. And what do we see? Is that God rejects them. The fool that rejects God will be rejected by God. That's a warning Psalm 53 gives. Verse 5 again. Then they will be filled with dread like no other, because God will scatter the bones of those who besiege you. You will put them to shame, for God has rejected them. The fool will be destroyed. That's what happened to Nabal in 1 Samuel 25, as the Lord struck him down. And this is what will happen to all fools. They will be destroyed. Suddenly they will come to this realization that there is a God who does see everything they've done, who does care about what they've done, and who will hold them to account for this. Terror will come upon them as God unleashes his judgment, resulting in their bones being scattered. What we have here is a devastating picture of God's rejection of a fool because of a fool's rejection of him. A fool that rejects God will be rejected by God. Now, where does this leave us? Where should this leave us? It should leave us overwhelmed. Because we are by nature fools that reject God who will be rejected by God. Just let that sink in for a moment. Because this is God's verdict on you apart from Christ. You are the fool who says no God for me, who is corrupt, whose deeds are vile, who does not do good, who does not seek God, and who God has rejected. How great a sinner we all are. How helpless we are. Now, there's a danger, I think, after reading this, that we hear this warning in this way. We hear this warning that the fool who rejects God will be rejected by God as saying to us, this is what you now need to do. Don't be a fool. That's a temptation when we come to this passage, is to hear about the fool and then to think, well, let's not be there. And whilst it is true that we're not to be fools, that's not the message we're to take from this psalm. You see, Psalm 53 is not saying to us, don't be a fool. It is saying, you are the fool. It's saying you have rejected God and you will be rejected by him. So face up to this. I know it's not uncomfortable hearing, but it needs to be heard. Because though the focus of the psalm is judgment coming to the fool, God's rejection of them, there is hope found within it for the fool who faces up to what this psalm is saying to him. This hope doesn't shine as brightly as it does in Psalm 14, but it is there, which brings us to the second thing we see here in Psalm 53, which is secondly, the fool that rejects God can be rescued by God. The fool that rejects God can be rescued by God. We see this in a couple of ways. Firstly, as David rewrites Psalm 14, implicitly acknowledging again that he is a fool who has rejected God, that he deserves to be rejected by God, he does so, but he doesn't expect it to happen to him. Because as he writes this psalm, even though he knows he is a fool, he has placed himself in a different category to the fool. He is now, verse 4, among those who God says, my people to, who are opposed by the fool, consumed by them. Or verse 5, besieged by them, which is what Doeg did to him in Psalm 52. It's what Nabal does to him here in Psalm 53. But then we also see him pray verse 6. Let me read verse 6 again. Oh, that deliverance would come from Zion, when God restores the fortunes of his people. Let Jacob rejoice, let Israel be glad. Here he's praying that God will deliver his people, that he would save them. No doubt in David's mind, salvation was from Saul and the keeping of the promise that God made to him that one day he'd be king of Israel. But more than that, in this prayer, David longs for one who would give lasting salvation to God's people, who can rescue the fool from God's rejection of them. As David prayed his prayer, he did not know what it would take for Israel's deliverance to come out of Zion, how he and all God's people, who by nature were fools, could be rescued by God. But someone would sing this psalm who did know. The Lord Jesus would have prayed Psalm 53, and he did so knowing that the fool who rejected God will be rejected by God. But he also knew that the fool who rejected God could be rescued by God. However, for that to happen, for those who are fools in the eyes of God to be rescued, the Lord Jesus knew that he would have to become a fool in the eyes of the world. And that is what he was willing to do for us. You see, Jesus, unlike David, was not the fool and never had been the fool. There was not a single moment of his life where he lived as if there was no God. There was nothing about him that could be said to be corrupt. He only did good. And when God gave his verdict on Jesus, like he did at Jesus' baptism, God's verdict for him was well pleased. Well pleased. Only did good. Yet as he died on the cross, the world thought of Jesus as a fool. And from a human's perspective, it looked like he was. He didn't look like someone God was well pleased with, but rather as one whom God had rejected as he received the punishment that fools deserve for their sin. But by doing that, he was the answer to this prayer of verse 6, that deliverance would come out of Zion, because by his death he secured salvation for those who are fools by nature. And this salvation he now offers to the fool who trusts in him, which means that the fool who rejects God can be rescued by God. So whilst we should be overwhelmed by the warning of the psalm that the fool who rejects God will be rejected by God, we don't need to stay overwhelmed, because though we are the fool, we can be rescued by God. We can be among those whom God says, my people too. But only if we turn from our foolish ways of living as if there is no God and start trusting in Jesus, who is God, to save us, and then start living with him as our God. The Apostle Peter on the day of Pentecost calls out to the crowd, be saved from this corrupt generation. And we can be. And for those of us who have, through faith in Christ, well, this psalm reminds us that we have something to look forward to. We can look forward to when God fully and finally restores the fortunes of his people when Jesus returns. You can look forward into joining in with rejoicing and gladness that will come from God's people on that day. And why? Why will we be rejoicing? Because on that day, this will be our testimony. We were once a fool who was going to be rejected by God. But now, we are the fool who has been rescued by God. Let's pray.